This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris on the day after Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Shane, and your family. Hope you guys had a great day.
Oh, we did. We actually had 3 Thanksgivings over the last couple of weeks. One at my church, one with my family, and one with my wife's extended family. So I'm going to be using my gym membership pretty intensely in the coming days.
I lived like a true gluttonous American. Yeah, we had 32 people over to the house, and I don't have that big of a house to quite pull that off. So was
how many of them were Wampanoag?
Yeah, none. Well, that's not true. I don't know. You know, we could run 23andMe, and I think probably at some level it would show up in a whole lot of people. But
somebody was bound to have 1/234,000th.
Yeah, that's right. And that could be a campaign slogan for running for president. It was a great day. We ended up having a whole lot of folks and a whole lot of food as usual, but just good folks, just a mix of folks that are from our church, that are friends, old friends, new friends. And it was really a good time. But, you know, kind of leading into Thanksgiving, and I'm tempted just to spend kind of all day talking about Black Friday, which is, something that I joke about often, that we spend Thursday giving thanks and Friday trampling security guards for flat screen TVs and iPhones. But before we talk about that, I think this year it was interesting. There's been a trend to not only downplay kind of the religious founding of the nation, or certainly the exceptional founding of America. There's also been, I just felt like this year there was an awful lot of articles in mainstream publications just saying, hey, you know, all that fun stuff that you think you know about Thanksgiving, well, it's not true. And to repeat that over and over and over. And I don't know, did you see those articles this year, Shane?
I was actually looking at one just before we started recording here. And the gist of it was basically you got to stop idolizing the Pilgrims. What you know isn't true. The Wampanoag had their own agenda going into the Thanksgiving Day feast. I mean, just within the last few hours, I've seen 3 articles along those lines. So I know exactly what you're talking about, John.
You know, one of the things, too, these parts that we were taught as being kind of part of American history, being a good thing, that history is being retold as if it were a bad thing. And look, I'm not one of those who thinks, for example, every American founder was an evangelical Christian, or that the founding of America was, full of, upstanding, heroic people, and there was never any who weren't fallen like the rest of us, and that there wasn't any mistreatment of the Native Americans. Of course there was. I mean, but there's a way to tell the story acknowledging the flaws and also seeing in it something really important. I did a Breakpoint this past week, and we'll link to it on the show notes if you come to breakpoint.org, on a phrase that I was always taught was something very important and very good growing up. I grew up in the Ronald Reagan presidency. He used this phrase a lot. I think he probably misused it here and there, but it's this phrase, we shall be as a city on a hill. And when people talk about that, a lot of times, in a critical way, what they're criticizing is this sense of American exceptionalism, that we're better than everyone, and that, the verses of the Old Testament having to do with Israel now can apply to us, and that we're the new God's chosen people. And that just simply wasn't what that phrase ever meant, and it's not what it was intended to mean. And I think it's something that even both sides of kind of the aisle, the pro-America and the anti-America sides of this, really I think both miss what this very important phrase meant to those who said it and those who heard it.
Well, as you pointed out, John, Barack Obama, as well as Ronald Reagan, used this phrase in various speeches. So it's a staple of American presidents and their rhetoric. And what I think you get right about your critique on Breakpoint is that we often think of America as a shining city on a hill, in the sense that it's that by default, as if America is the envy of the world, no matter how we act as a nation, no matter what we do. And that's obviously wrong. Winthrop's point in his sermon is that the community he helped found, and I think ultimately the country that traces its origins back to those first colonies, is uniquely visible to the world. right? And we're being watched with unique scrutiny, and have been for hundreds of years now. America is truly something new, and it's something uniquely worth being thankful for, I think, at this time of year. But there's no guarantee, John, that we'll, acquit ourselves nobly before the world. We have in the past made great fools of ourselves and done immoral things, and we can again. But on the other hand, there's something truly unique and special about this country, especially when you think about the Christian heritage that influenced the founding, and then the political liberties that have been bestowed upon us by our founding documents.
Yeah, and what John Winthrop, obviously, a couple of things to remember is John Winthrop wasn't talking about America here. He was talking about a group of pilgrims heading to this place that we now call Massachusetts, and he was talking about kind of this colonies, what they were trying to do, especially as opposed to where they were coming from. But it really was, and as he actually said it in this speech, and it comes from this wonderful sermon that he preached called A Model of Christian Charity. But essentially it's going to be, look, we can't hide. Listen, if we succeed, we'll succeed before the world. If we fail, we'll fail before the world. In other words, this is in front of everybody. This isn't something that we're just going to try on the side and no one's going to know and no one's going to think. This is going to be on the world stage. And of course, even he didn't have any understanding at that time just how true those words would actually be, like how much on the world stage this whole experiment would be.
Yeah, and that didn't even materialize fully or come to maturity fully until the 20th century. I mean, until then, America was somewhat of an isolationist country. So there's a sense in which the fathers didn't fully understand the heritage they were passing down to their sons. But I do think it is right, on the one hand, to look back on the founding of those early colonies and say, yeah, there's a vision here that carried forward into the founding of the nation as a whole, and that there's good things about that we need to celebrate and be thankful for, and thank to God, by the way, thankful to God, as they were. But at the same time, recognize that, yeah, this is a double-edged sword. What he's saying is, and his emphasis actually in the sermon is primarily on the negative, that if we fail, the whole world's going to see this, guys. So we have to be faithful to each other, keep faith to one another and to God.
Yeah, and look, this has been something that's been misused from presidents to historians to Christian speakers to leaders, really across the board. And it's interesting how you can actually see this change. I think Ross Douthat, in his wonderful book, Bad Religion, which I have found to be just a terrific, I think, cultural analysis of how American religion in particular has changed and how American reliance on religion has changed. I mean, if you go back to what Winthrop meant, historian Mark Signorelli puts it this way. He says, Winthrop intended the preeminence of a city at a hill to signify not the inherent superiority of the Plymouth settlement, but its notoriety. He did not wish to soothe the pilgrims' complacency by extolling their virtues, but to awaken their moral vigilance by reminding them of the iniquity toward which the human soul is always inclined. There's a good Calvinist line there. And what would be its catastrophic consequences in their perilous situation. It's an image, as he put it, of preeminent responsibility. And this is something that Lincoln points back to during the Civil War, when he's talking about this national, a sin of slavery. He says fondly, Lincoln at one point said, fondly we hope, fervently we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So they're seeing this experiment played out in front of the world. They're seeing it played out before God. But it's a very different take than when you get into the 20th century, and folks like Woodrow Wilson are taking this understanding of a Christian nation and kind of using it in an international doctrine, like, we are the city of the hill, we are the new chosen one, we've got to save everybody else. It's a very, very different phrase and a very, very different use of that phrase.
Well, yeah, exactly. And the transition that takes place there, John, is one from explicitly Christian religion. You were speaking my language a second ago there, quoting Calvinists, and into a civic religion, almost a deism, of sorts. And you see that among some of the better known American founders. Certainly they had a less specifically Christian view, but that begins to then take over to where we see ourselves as having a divine duty to spread freedom and democracy around the world. And yeah, you're right, that's a transition, and that needs to be pointed out. But I think there's a kernel in there of something that's true, but we need to set aside our idolatry of nation enough to realize that there's nothing inherent about America that's too big to fail. We can very much fail, and have in small way, in particular ways in the past, and can wholly as a nation. But by God's grace, I think it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris, talking about the stories happening in our culture from a Christian worldview. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. And speaking of history and speaking of nations and speaking of, trying to order our societies, we're seeing this happen in kind of real time across the Western pond, I guess you could say, with the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, and just where this is going to go. And we've talked a lot about this, Shane, but it's worth mentioning that there was a historic turnout in elections in Hong Kong in the midst of these protests, some of which are becoming increasingly violent. But there was a landslide victory to the pro-democracy candidates, and a number of seats lost by kind of the pro-Chinese. And there was a historic turnout. And all of that points to the fact that the people of Hong Kong are not ready to lose this experiment of handling their own business in their own way and not becoming just an extension of the Communist Party. It was a remarkable thing to see. And, of course, the question is now, how's China going to respond? And even in response to that, President Trump clearly came down in some of his actions this week on the side of Hong Kong, which is interesting because he's a negotiator, and we've seen him how he handled the situation with Turkey and the Kurds and so on. And it's different here, where he is clearly coming down in support of the pro-democracy forces of Hong Kong.
Yeah, when you say number of seats, these are local officials, but it was kind of seen as from what I understand, as a symbolic election in favor of democracy. It was 242 that were flipped from loyal communists to pro-democracy candidates. So that's a substantial statement there, even if it is just municipal authorities in a way. But John, I'm looking at all of the analysis coming out of this. The thing that really struck me the most was a Washington Post opinion piece, very stirring, a couple of days ago, and it invokes George Orwell's 1984 as a sort of a template for the kind of resistance Hong Kongers are putting up right now. And I say stirring because the author really gets across that liberty is something precious, and it's something worth fighting for, especially when one comes up against a regime like Communist China, which is literally intent on controlling the thoughts and beliefs of its people. I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. They're actually, coming up with facial recognition software to try and stamp out resistance before it even begins. When you see what they've done to the Uyghur communities, China is going full totalitarianism, and the people of Hong Kong are trying to resist in any way they can. I mean, that's something that the United States is historically committed to, right? We were just talking about that a moment ago, to supporting these kinds of movements.
Yeah, and one of the factors there, of course, that's making such a difference is that in Hong Kong, they have access to the story. So, they have a better idea about what that crackdown by the Chinese government in the mainland, it looks like, than those on the mainland do, right? I mean, they have a better idea of it because they're seeing that big picture. And how many times have we seen protesters in Hong Kong refer to the treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs and say, look, we know where this is going. But the bigger question now is, I mean, this is clearly a statement made to the Communist Party by the people of Hong Kong in this election, where you had this record turnout, we have this record number of seats, more than triple what they previously held. And how is Beijing going to respond? And I think there's really two things at play here. The economic prosperity of Hong Kong is something that China really needs right now, especially because, listen, the Chinese are dealing with so many issues within their own walls. I mean, the more you crack down on freedom, the more you have to guarantee some sort of stability. And the economic stability that's been the kind of the swap for the loss of freedoms, by the Chinese, that economic stability is showing cracks. I mean, serious cracks. Not only the huge amount of debt, but also the reduction in the workforce, and that's coming because of 30, 40 years of a one-child policy. I mean, they've set themselves up socially for not having a way forward. So the question is will China's crackdown be kind of held back because of needing kind of the economic stability, the economic contribution of Hong Kong? I had among the guests at my house yesterday were two students from China studying here in the United States, as well as my cousin who lives in Hong Kong, flying planes for FedEx, and also my some good friends who grew up in that part of the world, and some friends who actually just spent the last 4 years there. So we had some very, very interesting conversations about this, and their take on the ground is you got to understand. Look, when we think economic prosperity, we think 3 years out. We think maybe 1 year out. We think an election cycle. That's as long as we think out. But people in other parts of the world, especially China, they're thinking 100 years out. And their plan is what you might call long-term planning, and we don't have that. And so to think that this crackdown is not going to happen because they're going to bow over because of the economic pressure is wrong. And on the other hand, to think that they're going to crack down immediately as opposed to this kind of long, systemic, patient, implementing plan to get to where they want to be, that's much more likely. So that was the vote around our Thanksgiving table. But this is real tragic. And then, of course, the question is if China does actually respond, at least like most of the guests at my Thanksgiving think they're going to respond, then, of course, that demands a response from the rest of the world, and what that's going to look. What is that going to look like?
Yeah, I think we mentioned this before, John, but it's really worth saying again, especially as we think about Thanksgiving and the birth of the American colonies. The abuses that led those colonists to eventually declare independence from Great Britain 150 years after the first Thanksgiving were no minor complaints. I mean, we can say that. King George was really throwing his weight around. But compared with how China treats those under its thumb today, and how it wants to treat those that are not quite under its power, but it would like to be under their power again, Hong Kong, Taiwan. The 1770s were a tea party, man. China is really testing the limits on this one. And I think you're exactly right to say those naive Westerners who look at this and say, Hong Kong's the goose that laid the golden egg. They can't crack down on Hong Kong. They can't sacrifice that economic prosperity. I think they're more than willing to do so. And the question is, what does effective resistance to tyranny look like? I'm not sure I know the answer, John, but I can't condemn those who are doing their level best, whether it be with bows and arrows or ballots, to turn this thing in their favor.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more interesting and inspiring things that I've seen coming out of this is when Western media outlets are interviewing these protesters in Hong Kong. I mean, they're almost stunned to hear the words like, essentially freedom or death. There's not a way forward here. And we haven't thought that way, here in the U.S. for, like you said, about 300 years. So anyway, it's a different thing, and it's going to be fascinating to watch it play out. But tragically, it's going to impact, millions and millions and millions of people at the same time. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
At the Colson Center, we often hear from Breakpoint listeners about the impact our commentaries and podcasts have on their lives. One Breakpoint listener named Rebecca recently told us, "I've always enjoyed learning more about worldview and how to live out my Christian faith in light of a variety of challenging issues. However, in the past couple of years, the Colson Center's work has become more than enjoyable for me. It has become faith-saving." If Breakpoint has impacted you anywhere near the way it has Rebecca, please take this opportunity to join thousands of others expressing their gratitude in advance of Giving Tuesday, which is this coming Tuesday, December 3rd. You can give online at breakpoint.org/podcast. That's breakpoint.org/podcast. Thank you.
Shane Morris here, along with John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint This Week. John, we saw another news story this week that really caught my attention. We had the another debate for the Democrats, the 2020 presidential hopefuls. And one of the things that's continually come out of this primary season is that this crop of Democratic hopefuls are committed to abortion. I mean, they are just all about it. The New York Times actually did a survey of the 2020 Democratic candidates, and it shows that every single one of them supports codifying Roe v. Wade into federal law. That includes allowing Medicaid coverage of abortion by repealing the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal funding from going to abortion, and removing funding restrictions for organizations that actually provide abortion referrals. And the article says almost all of them say they would nominate only judges who support abortion rights, an explicit pledge Democrats have long avoided. Most are also in favor, by the way, of making abortion legal in all circumstances, even late in pregnancy. 7 of them want abortion pills available over the counter. 9 support a federal approval process for state abortion laws to prevent laws that sort of violate the pro-choice orthodoxy from going into effect. According to the Times, the 2020 presidential candidates' responses on this reflect a fundamental change in the Democratic Party's approach to reproductive issues. The interesting thing about this to me, John, is that according to polling, the Democratic Party is out of alignment with the American people as a whole on this. They're much more committed to abortion than the public is.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is, when was the last time we heard safe, legal, and rare, from anywhere? It's a stunning thing to see it, especially because we're also, as you said, being out of touch with the American people. The American people are moving more towards wanting to restrict where we currently are when it comes to abortion law. We have some of the most liberal abortion laws on the planet. I mean, we are in a very small company of countries that we don't want to be in when it comes to abortion restrictions. I mean, most of Europe restrict abortion after particular stages of development. The idea that we want a federal process for approving state abortion laws, that's a stunning thing for people who are trying to run for president in mid-America to actually come down on, not to mention repealing the Hyde Amendment, not to mention everything else. But I think, that was the story of the 2016 election, right? That the Democratic candidate at the time, Hillary Clinton, was just largely not in touch with a mass part of America. In the run-up to that election, the media coverage was clearly also out of touch. And I think we're seeing that same thing. I mean, it's not just, Shane, that these candidates are saying these things. It's that the media coverage of these policies are talking about these policies as if they're very rational, normal ideas, and that anyone opposing them are the radicals. And that, again, is just not where most of America is. And not just religious America. Most people just aren't comfortable with it. And I think increasingly young people aren't comfortable with it. Now, I've said for a long time, the polls that say that young people are more pro-life than their parents, needs to have an asterisk beside it, because it's one thing to say that on a poll. It's another thing to say that as a moral relativist, right? I mean, this generation is more relativistic when it comes to moral norms than any generation that's ever lived on the planet. And so there's a big difference between saying I'm pro-life and saying I want abortion overturned and everything else that comes along with that. But at the same time, this is just not where people are. This is the generation that's lived with abortion. They know that they're missing siblings. They know friends who have paid the price emotionally, even physically, for being told that, oh, this is just like another procedure when it's clearly not. So they've seen it. I think we're, Ed Stetzer used to say, when the history of politics goes down, we'll say, and this is how politics works. well, except for 2016, as if it were an outlier. But one of the big things that made 2016 an outlier is reproducing itself, literally right before us. Let me give you another example, and that I saw this week, not on the abortion issue, but having to do with Mayor Pete Buttigieg. There was an article, a headline that I saw pop up 2 or 3 times. It was an AP piece that was carried in the Washington Post and then was actually even carried in my own local newspaper, in which Mayor Pete was compared to President Obama. Mayor Pete channels President Obama in some speech. And I didn't read the details of it. I just saw that headline and thought, that's a clear example of how the media is completely missing the story. Here's why, Shane. Do you know how Mayor Pete is polling among African Americans?
It's abysmal.
No, it's 0. It's literally 0. It's not even. Yeah, I mean, it's worse than abysmal, if that's possible. I mean, do you know he's polling at 0? And you know why? I mean, at some level, it's because, Joe Biden polls pretty well with African Americans because of his connection with President Obama. But on another level, it's because African American, especially political leaders who tend to be religious leaders in the African American community, they are not comfortable with a gay man as president. It is just not. And this idea that he could channel President Obama to this community is telling us that the media is completely out of touch on this one as well.
Well, that would make him, the 3rd black president, since Bill Clinton was the 1st, according to the media. Yeah, that's just absurd. Pete Buttigieg, he's like mainline white Protestantism personified. The advocacy involved in painting him as a new Obama, it just begs understanding.
No, it does, but it's also, what are we seeing right now? Because you also have the disconnect between the Democratic voters and the Democratic kingmakers, the ones who actually decide. And Buttigieg right now, I mean, look, we're early. It's going to be interesting to see after these first couple states of primaries where this goes from here. But he's the one poised to pick up the lead as we're watching the collapse of Biden, as we're watching Elizabeth Warren prove herself to be an unbelievable candidate. And what I mean by unbelievable is literally it's unbelievable. You can't actually believe her because she can't deliver on everything that she's saying. And it's so both of these guys are dropping in the polls, and Buttigieg is poised to take it. And so there's just, I think, again, an enormous difference. But your point earlier about the difference between where most Americans are on the abortion issue and, of course, where we want it to be is unthinkable and illegal. That's the Christian worldview position, is that our laws should reflect human dignity, and human dignity should make it so that the taking of unborn, innocent human life is completely off the table. We're just seeing kind of, again, out of touch. It is out of touch. And there is just a big difference between those who are live in an echo chamber and listen to each other all the time talk about this stuff and where most Americans are.
Yeah, the polling is crystal clear on this, John. NPR reported earlier this year, in fact, that while most Americans want abortion to remain legal, in other words, they're not consistently pro-life, or what you and I would think of as consistently pro-life, only 21% think it should be legal in all circumstances, which has essentially become the Democratic Party's new platform on the issue. Not even in the Democratic Party, in fact, does a majority support abortion for all reasons on demand throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. That's actually in the 40% range. So what that means is that the party has been hijacked by abortion extremism. Well, Americans as a whole, rather, are mostly in favor of restricting abortion to some degree. In fact, according to the same polls, a majority of registered voters support restricting abortion to, like you said earlier, to within the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is much more in line with the way Europe actually does this. So I don't believe that any intentional abortion is moral. You and I are agreed on that. My point here is that the Democratic Party is veering in an incredibly extreme direction. And historically, John, when the Democratic Party makes abortion an issue, when it becomes a big issue in an election, it hurts them. It doesn't help them. So I mean, maybe this is my sort of optimistic eschatology coming out here, but I like the way this is going so far.
Yeah, well, yeah, we have made it a tendency to not make political predictions on this program, mainly because they all tend to be wrong. But we'll see how this one plays out. Well, thanks for joining us again as we talked about the stories happening in our culture from a Christian worldview. You can follow us at breakpoint.org, breakpoint.org. And join us each and every week right here. If you come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link you to some of the articles and stories that we talked about on today's program. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.